The NHL's first buyout period is set to begin here in a few days once the Stanley Cup final is over. Today we're going to review the top 10 candidates that are most likely to be bought out once that period opens, and that's coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, today we're looking at the top buyout candidates for the upcoming offseason. The buyout window is about to be opened here in a few days once the Stanley Cup final comes to an end. And obviously, we are not all that far away from that happening. By the time this video makes it to YouTube, it's actually possible that it might already be over. So we're going to take a look at an article here from Frank Serafalli of dailyfaceoff.com where he lists the top 10 players that he feels are the buyout candidates. I'll give you my thoughts and opinions, and I'm also going to throw in a few extra players as well and my own thoughts here that could be candidates as well. Now, first up, this one should be a slam dunk, and it's New York Ranger defenseman Tony Deangelo. The Rangers have made it clear he's never going to play for them again, and obviously a buyout for them is pretty inexpensive given the fact that he's a younger player. They only have to do a 1/3 buyout. When the player is older and has more experience of 7 years or more, it's a 2/3 buyout instead, so it's more costly. No matter what their age are, though, is the buyout amount over twice the amount of period of time. And Tony Deangelo has 1 year left of $4.8 million. So obviously that's not a ton of money for the Rangers. They would get a lot of that cap space back. They would save $3.5 million, and they would have one extra year tacked on at $883,000. So given the fact that they were unable to trade this player, it's pretty much a given, and he'll be one of the first players announced as being bought out of his current contract. Next up, we have James Neal of the Edmonton Oilers, who's got 2 years left at $5.75 million. Now, I do believe the Oilers are going to have a few other candidates here as well, and I understand why Serafalli lists Neal here as a good candidate, given the fact that of all their buyout candidates, he's probably got the worst contract of the bunch. Now, his first year with Edmonton was pretty decent, scored 19 goals, but last year was not great, fell down into the lineup, was a healthy scratch at times, is kind of fallen out of favor there, and they would love to have that cap space back to do other things with. So Neal, like I said, 2 years to go, would end up being on their books for 4 years. They would save $3.8 million in the first 2 years, so the final 2 years of the deal, but then they'd have dead cap space for 2 additional years at 1.9. So if they can find another way out via trade, so if they do that Duncan Keith deal, for example, if the Chicago Blackhawks would take him back, that would certainly be preferable. But if that's not going to be an option for Edmonton, a buyout certainly is possible. But they could also look to a guy like Mikko Koskinen, who's only got 1 year left at $4.5 million, and they would save $3 million for the upcoming season and have one additional year tacked on at 1.5. And you could throw Kyle Turris in there as well as a potential candidate as well. But still, I'm not sure what the Oilers do. It's believed they might even do more than one buyout. Based on comments from Ken Holland earlier this offseason, he led to believe that it might even be possible to see more than one, but obviously they'll try to trade some of these players first. But I think a James Neal and a Mikko Koskinen buyout is a definite possibility heading into the offseason here for Edmonton. Now, at number 3, he lists Erik Johnson of the Colorado Avalanche, who's got 2 years left at $6 million and a full no-move clause. Now, I'm assuming Serafalli's rationale here is because of the expansion draft. Obviously, some of these buyouts could have expansion draft implications, given the fact that they may need to move players that have no-move clauses and free up a spot to protect a different player that they'd rather keep. Obviously, Johnson at $6 million is maybe not the most favorable contract on the team, but I do think they need his size and strength back there on the blue line, and I do think it's fair to say they missed him in the playoffs when their smaller, more mobile defensemen like Samuel Girard were having a tougher time against bigger opponents and kind of getting shoved around a little bit back there. I think they could use some more size and strength, and having Johnson back would be a big help. It would be nice if he made less money for sure, but I'm not entirely convinced that this actually takes place, but I understand what Serafalli is saying here. However, I do think it's a real possibility he will waive his no-move clause and allow them to protect another defenseman instead, which would let them protect probably Makar, Taves, and Girard are the most likely candidates. They would be at risk to lose Ryan Graves, which is a concern, and they may end up making a trade to shake things up to protect themselves better that way. I think the Avs are a real possibility for a team we'll see make a trade ahead of expansion to minimize their loss here. Now, if they do buy out Johnson, they'll save $4 million in each of the next 2 seasons, which would be an additional amount that would be awesome for them to have, but then they would end up with additional 2 years on the books here for the Johnson contract with over a $2 million cap hit. So it's not the cheapest deal to do. They would be tied to the deal for 4 years instead of 2, and I'm not entirely convinced this happens, but I do understand why Serafalli has him on the list. Next up, we have Florida defenseman Keith Yandle with 2 years left at $6.35 million, and it's apparent that the Florida Panthers really want to move on from Yandle this offseason, heading into the early part of this season before the games even get underway of the 56-game campaign. It was looking like he could be a healthy scratch and his Ironman streak could be in jeopardy. Of course, Yandle is the Ironman streak holder right now in the NHL, not too far off from the record set by Doug Jarvis, and he would like to achieve that, and he can stay healthy and be productive. But obviously Yandle's two-way game has certainly slipped defensively. He's not really all that great, and I think that's where their shortcomings fall, where they're kind of frustrated with what he can deliver. Obviously in the power play, he can be productive, but outside of that, he's not as great as he used to be. So I do think there's a real chance we'll see a divorce between these two parties this offseason, but a buyout will prove to be costly here for Florida. It would save $4 million in the first season next year, which is great, but then the year after his cap hit's still going to be $5.39 million, so there's not much of a savings there at all, and they would no longer have the player. Plus, they have an additional 2 years tacked on at $1.24 million. So I'm not really convinced that this deal takes place either via buyout. If they can retain 50% and trade him, they'd be better off, to be honest. That might be a tough deal to find, but I think that they'll certainly try that prior to going to the buyout route, because especially in year two, that's brutal to have such a high cap hit and dead space when you don't have the player attached to it. I'm just not entirely convinced this takes place either, but I'm also convinced that he won't be in Florida next year one way or another. Next up, we have Martin Jones of the San Jose Sharks with 3 years left at $5.75 million. We've been one of the more costly buyouts on this list here, and I understand why Sarah Valley gets him on the list, because he's been a part of the Sharks for the last few years, has been a big part of the problem. They can't get a big save when they really need one. They have a lot of other players too tied up in a lot of money when it comes to like Carlson and Vlasic and Burns and Couture, and I just don't even think this team can properly rebuild, which I do believe is what it really needs. But at the end of the day here, if they can move on from this Jones contract and get a more adequate goaltender who can produce some big saves when needed, maybe they can get things turned around and do more of a reset or a retool here and get things back on track and be more competitive. But ultimately, Jones has been a major issue for them with the inconsistencies of the past few seasons. They would save a fair bit of money in the next 3 years at $3.8 million, followed by a $3.3 savings, and then a $2.8 savings in the final year of the contract. But then they'd have dead cap space for an additional 3 years beyond that of $1.6 million per season. Now, of course, out of all the deals, it is a little bit more costly, but by the time we're near those $1.6 million dead cap spaces, at least there's a chance the cap could be starting to go up. So they could take the savings now and might be able to better handle that down the road. So I do think there's a decent possibility that this actually does occur. Before we go into the second half of these buyout candidates, I do want to pause and acknowledge one of our channel sponsors, The Ultimate Fan. Now, if you're an ultimate hockey fan yourself and you have yourself a fan cave, man cave, she shed, or sports bar, or any kind of big room that you use to watch sports in, this could be the ultimate accessory to really take your room up a notch. There will be a link down below in the pinned comment as well as the description if you want to check out the fans as well as consider making a purchase. So I'm going to let you now have a full view of these NHL licensed products from The Ultimate Fan.
Stay cool while cheering on your favorite NHL team with your own customized Ultimate Hockey ceiling fan. Choose from home, away, third jersey, wood, and vintage blade themes. Then select from 2 hockey-like fixture designs, our puck that illuminates your favorite team logo, or our 3D goalie mats. The Ultimate Hockey Fan looks great in any kids' room, she shed, man cave, or sports bar. Not only do our fans cool your room, they make your room look cool. Order your custom fan today at ultimatehockeyfans.com.
Thanks very much for checking that out. I do greatly appreciate it. I certainly do recommend checking it out. I think it's certainly a really cool product. Now, moving on to the next candidate here. We have Zach Parise with 4 years left at $7.5 million. Now, one thing is clear about Parise and the Wild, and it looks as though that the Wild really want to move on, and I think Parise would like to go somewhere where he could have a chance to play more often as well. I don't know exactly where that would be. It's not going to be an easy deal to find. Obviously, if they can trade the player, would be preferable, but if they cannot, a buyout is possible, but at the same time here, it's going to be a long-term thing and be quite expensive. Since he has 4 years left on this deal, they're going to be tied to this contract for an additional 4 years on top of that, so 8 years total if they go down this road. The upcoming season, they would save a whopping $5.1 million, which would go a long way to getting their top RFA signed. Obviously, they signed Erik Johnson. They need to get Kaprizov signed, Kevin Fiala. They're rumored to be going after a top center like a Jack Eichel or Kuznetsov. So clearly, they need the space. But after that one season, they would not have nearly the savings in year two. In year two, they would only save just over $1 million. They'd still have a really big cap hit. And in years 3 and 4, they'd only save $166,000. So it's really not a great idea. They didn't have 4 years beyond that, a dead cap space of $833,000. So certainly this Parise buyout would be mega expensive. They'd only get the benefit short term, and then they'd be really conflicted cap-wise. So to me, I don't know that this happens. To me, they'd be better off to trade him and maybe try to take back a different contract. Maybe if they can find a different contract structured differently, perhaps it would be more preferred to buy out a different kind of deal if they could do it. He was rumored to be swapped for Andrew Ladd and some other assets going back and forth with the Islanders last year. I have no idea if they will revisit that or not, but this contract is a problem for Minnesota. A buyout's really expensive, so I'm going to say that it's not real likely to happen, although I certainly understand why they at least consider it. Next up, we have Canucks forward Jake Virtanen, who's got 1 year left at $2.55 million. And like Tony Deangelo, he's a younger player, still in RFA status, so a buyout's cheap. It's only 1/3 over 2 times the length. So out of the $2.55 million, they would get back all but $50,000 of that cap hit for next season. So they would save almost $2.5 million. So that's a big help. But now the year after, they'd have dead cap space of $500,000. We know that Jake Virtanen is tied up in some off-ice issues, which I know the team put him on a leave of absence for. I don't know if there's any rules around that, if they'd have any issues doing a buyout, but I think it's fair to say at this point, they're more than ready to move on from the player. I imagine Jim Benning and his staff regret giving Virtanen the second year on that contract when they signed him just over a year ago. And this is an easy way to get their cap space back, buy the player out, and move on. It's just unfortunate that they won't be able to trade him to get anything back in return. Next up, we have goaltender Ben Bishop of the Dallas Stars, who's got a full no-move clause and 2 years left at $4.9 million. Now, Sarah Valley has Bishop on this list, I'm sure more so because of expansion draft implications. Now, Bishop, like I said, he's got a full no-move, so he has to be protected. Jake Ottinger is the goalie of the future for this team, at least it appears that way, and he is exempt because he doesn't have enough pro experience yet. So that leaves Anton Stralman to be exposed, and clearly he's likely going to be taken. That's a problem for the Stars, who have relied heavily on Stralman for the past couple of years as Bishop has been out injured. Now, obviously, I understand that moving Bishop won't be easy. One, he has to agree to it, and secondly, who's going to take on a goalie who's 34 years old, making almost $5 million and barely played the last couple of years? So not going to be an easy task. I understand why a buyout would be something that would be considered, but it's not going to come cheap at all. They're only going to save $1.66 million each of the next 2 seasons, which is a nice savings, but it's not enough really to really go down this road. I don't think they have 2 years additional on top of that with a cap hit of over $800,000 in dead space. I mean, if you're only going to save $1.66 million, Stralman makes 3.3. So if you lose Stralman in expansion, you get more cap space back. You might not like losing that goalie instead of Bishop, but it might make more sense. It might be better off just to cut your losses, let them take Stralman, and move on and to see if Bishop's healthy enough to play and be part of the team and finish out that contract for at least 1 more year. I'm not sure what Dallas does here, but it's not really ideal no matter how we shake it. A Bishop buyout's expensive, but you really don't want to lose Stralman. But I'm not sure that it entirely makes sense to go down the road of a buyout in this case. Next up, we have Habs forward Paul Byron, who's got 2 years left at $3.4 million. Now, Sarah Valley has Byron on this list because of the fact he was a healthy scratch a lot this past regular season. Certainly appeared to be a player that Montreal was willing to move on from, but he has played more regular and played a bigger role in their run to the Stanley Cup Finals here in the 2021 NHL Playoffs. But still, going into next year, the Habs are going to have a lot of tough decisions to make. They only had just over $10 million in cap space, and they have a lot of players on expiring deals. They have like half their forward group is on either RFA or UFA status going into the offseason. They have a couple other players as well in the other parts of the team. So they're going to not be able to bring back this team exactly as they are without making some trades. Obviously, they're going to lose a player in expansion. And if Byron's not bought out, he could be one of those players. The Seattle Kraken are likely going to be able to pick from guys like Jake Allen, Paul Byron, Jake Evans, They might have a defenseman that's available depending on how they go about things. I think Montreal might go with 8 skaters so they can protect their top 4D. And, with 4 forwards, it's going to expose a couple more forwards, but would you rather lose them or like a Joel Edmondson or a Ben Sherratt or one of those guys? Petrie and Weber are going to be protected. So it's difficult to say here how this works, but Montreal's going to have some hard choices, and Byron moving on might give them that cap space, might make things a little bit easier, and he's probably an easier player to replace than many of the other guys that we just mentioned here. We'd have cap savings of $2.8 million and $1.6 million respectively in the next 2 years. Years 3 and 4, they would have dead cap space of $1.33, so not ideal to have that dead cap space in years 3 and 4, but it might be something they have to consider doing. And number 10 on our list is Ducks forward Sonny Milano, who's also a younger player like Virtanen and Deangelo, which makes things a lot easier to do. He has 1 year left at $1.7 million. The Ducks would get $1.5 million of that back immediately after the buyout and only have a $500,000 cap hit in year 2. And they would only have a cap hit of $300,000 in the second year as dead cap space. So it's really not that difficult to deal with. And Milano's not living up to that contract. I think it's a player they'd like to move on from, and it's a pretty safe bet that it's a real possibility Bob Murray could go down that road here for the Anaheim Ducks in this case. Now, another player I'd consider as well, it's not on this list, is Jake Gardiner of the Hurricanes, who's got 2 years left at $4 million. That really hasn't worked out at all. He's been a spare part for them. Making $4 million is, not ideal for them. They could save some cap space by doing this buyout. They would save $2.7 million in the first year, $3 million in the second year, but then they'd have 2 years of dead space of 1.3 afterwards. So not really ideal, but then again, they could use that space to do other things with because they have some big decisions to make as well, like many of these other NHL teams. And personally, I think a Gardiner buyout does make sense for the short-term basis here for Carolina. And another guy to keep your eye on as well is Anton Stralman in Florida. Like Yandle, he's a veteran defenseman that the Panthers would like to move on from. He's got 1 year left at $5.5 million. And if they do a buyout, they would save $3 million next year, which could go a long way to making other areas of the team better. They would then have 1 year of dead space of 1.5. So the Stralman contract, the way it's structured, actually isn't too bad compared to a guy like Yandle. So if anything, he's probably a more likely candidate, in my opinion, to be bought out than Yandle. I think a Yandle situation would be preferred to be handled via trade, but we'll see what the Panthers can figure out. That is all the buyout candidates we're talking about here today. If you feel there are any others, let me know down in the comments. Let me know which players I talked about here today you feel are the most likely candidates to be bought out as well, and we can discuss further. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the latest news and rumors in all 32 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.